I'm going to share some of the more unusual techniques that I used while writing my latest batch of songs, which I call the Winter EP. If you're interested in listening to this, you can follow the link down below. So after a several year dry spell, I just wanted to get some new material finished as quick as I possibly could. I've been playing live a lot more often and getting sick of playing the same old songs every single time. So I just wanted to get some new material done and out the door as quickly as I possibly could. What has historically never worked for me is waiting for that exact moment when I'm struck by inspiration at the same exact moment when I have some free time. And I'm sure that everyone can relate to that. So I used a few techniques to jumpstart the process and force some quick results, which I will go into detail about next. Most importantly, I wanted to leave my tendency for perfectionism out of this project. If the songs were overly simple, that would be fine. If the lyrics were lacking depth, if the recording was a little sloppy, if the mixing and mastering left something to be desired, that would all be okay for this project. A decently listenable end result was all that I would be aiming for. It turns out that I actually exceeded my original expectations in a lot of ways. Not only did I get a few songs done quickly, but they ended up being a lot less simple than I originally intended. I ended up writing a bit outside of my usual style and came up with several more usable ideas in the process of developing just a few songs. I also didn't want to apply a lot of music theory in the process. It's my belief that the more I try to follow the rules, the less creative that I am able to be. So I'm sure that's a huge sigh of relief for everyone. There will be very, very little music theory in this discussion. So I thought back to my earliest acoustic songs that I wrote circa 2010 or so and really thought about the components of these songs. A simple 2 or 3 chord sequence with a cool finger picking pattern applied to it, and then I would just strum the same chords for a vocal bed. Then I would just switch it up to something else for the sake of variety, kind of alternating back and forth between hooky vocal parts and interesting instrumental breaks. Keeping it very simple was the goal in mind here. So that's an easy formula to follow. All I needed were some interesting chords to start with. I figured a good way to kickstart some ideas would be to consider all of the songs that I already know how to play and just pick the absolute coolest sounding chords from each one. The rule being that I wouldn't use any straight up major or minor chords, only the ones that have interesting voicings, chords that you don't normally hear in every single song. So I wrote down a bunch of examples of these chords and I broke out the sound recording app on my phone and just started improvising, coming up with interesting finger picking patterns based on this list of chords that I made. While I was improvising, if any changes or variations immediately came to mind, I would include those in the recording as well, and I would try to make note of what finger positions I was using when I made these additions to the original finger picking pattern. So I would end up with just a simple and short improv session, 2 minutes long tops, even if all I did was just pluck each string of the chord and maybe just add a note or two. Simple was going to be just fine here. After I was finished playing around with each chord, I started a new recording and started the process over again until I had several decent ideas to work with. So my next step was just to sleep on it and come back to the project with a fresh and unbiased set of ears. I took all of these recorded clips from my phone and I transferred them over to the PC so I could load them up into Reaper. And of course you can use whatever DAW that you prefer. I like to use Reaper. I find it much easier to use the DAW to help with the writing process. That way I can record each new idea that I have and I can visually cut and paste and arrange all of these ideas into sort of a rough draft version. This makes it very easy to compile and to remember everything that I'm working on. So from my previous improv session, I chose the 5 best takes and decided that these would be the ideas that I would try to develop into full songs. And of course, the next question would be, what comes next after that initial riff idea? How do I write more parts to go along with my original concept? This is usually a difficult step, and this is usually where the songwriting process comes to a halt for many people, myself included. So you could be tempted to figure out what key you've been playing in and then look up a chord progression chart and figure out what the next logical chord choices would be from there. But I said we wouldn't be using any music theory to make these decisions, and I stuck with that concept to pretty good results. Instead, I simply asked myself, do we want the next chord to be higher or lower? Starting with the lowest note of the chord, I either moved up or down the neck, or I moved up or down a string until I landed on another bass note that made for a pleasing transition. I would kind of work out a bass line for the progression before coming up with the rest of the voices, again trying not to overthink it too much. Once I had a good idea of which bass notes I wanted to use, then I simply figured out what other notes would sound good along with these bass notes, with the only consideration being, what notes can I comfortably hit with my other fingers while still holding down the original bass note, and what notes would make a nice sounding transition from the previous chord. I was kind of purposely trying to avoid traditional major and minor triad voicings. I wanted to end up with some harmonies that sounded a little bit more unusual for a solo acoustic song. You could keep this much simpler if you wanted to, but it's always been my preference and tendency to use more than just the basic chords. So we're basically operating completely off of vibes alone and trying to add a few extra chords to each one of our original concept recordings. I tried to make use of every happy accident that I made in the process, or at least just record them so I wouldn't forget them later. And if I decided not to use one of these happy accidents in the final arrangement, then it would go back into my pool of potential future song ideas, my master list of cool starting chords. Sometimes it was obvious that a new idea would extend the original chord progression, and sometimes it was obvious that the new chord I added would be the next part of the song. In this way, I created more depth in my chord progressions, and I added additional parts to each one of my song ideas. Even if a new chord would create kind of an awkward key change, as long as it sounded cool to me, I would use it. In fact, in certain cases, I would change the key on purpose to quickly generate a new part. Without applying any music theory, a trick that I like to use is to keep the same chord shape and fingering and just move that shape arbitrarily up or down the neck to a different note. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it ends up sounding too weird. It's all about finding the right spot to jump to. You can hear this used a little bit on my new song Molehill, and also used heavily on the track called Rain on My Guitar. And again, there is a link to this new EP of mine down in the description if you are interested in hearing it. In general, if I was changing from a quieter part, I would try to make the next part a bit heavier. If I was changing from a finger-picking part, then the next part I would probably try strumming, or vice versa. If I was changing from picking to strumming or from strumming to picking, often I would try to keep the chords mostly identical between the two parts if I could get away with it. So this is the basis of how I would add extra parts to each one of my new song ideas, just repeating and iterating on the process of creating new chords and adding those chords to the arrangement. until I had enough material, enough changes to fill out a solid 4 minutes or so when I put it all together. There were just a few cases where I got stuck and I couldn't come up with the next part to a song, and these are the only cases where I would actually apply any music theory to the process. Something you can pretty much always rely on is that the perfect fifth will sound good and creates a powerful chord change. It's a very simple trick and it worked like a charm everywhere I applied this concept. I would take the beginning chord of a progression and I would figure out what note was a perfect fifth higher or lower than the root note, and I would use that as the root note for the next phrase. And this alone was enough to kickstart some ideas and keep adding new parts to the song. Now, of course, I didn't immediately fall in love with every single idea that I created using these methods. I would play back my rough draft songs and listen with a very critical ear and just ask myself, does this part fit here? Does it serve the song and make it stronger? Or do things flow better if I remove it from the arrangement? Could this part work better if I put it earlier or later in the song? In a few cases, I ended up cutting some parts that I actually really enjoyed. It's a hard decision to make, but the end goal is to create a cohesive song with good transitions and no filler. But I think it's important to approach things with the mindset that every good idea is usable somehow. So some of these parts that I removed actually ended up becoming the starting point for other new songs. So it was actually a much better decision to cut some things out and develop these ideas in their own separate direction. 2 of the songs on my new album were actually born this way. Out of my original 5 song concepts, I ended up not even using 2 of them, but I replaced them by developing a few ideas that had been cut out from other songs, and I actually believe that these are the strongest tracks on the album now. With all of the guitar parts finished in a usable rough draft recording, next I would move on to the vocals. I've already gotten very long-winded in my explanation here, so maybe we'll just split this up into a 2-part video. Stay tuned, because next time we're going to discuss my lyric and vocal writing techniques. Please remember to like and subscribe if you feel like I have earned it, and don't forget to check out my latest album, the Winter EP. Link is available down below. At the time of uploading this, the Winter EP is also available on Spotify, Apple Music, anywhere where normal people would usually listen to music. It is available on all major streaming platforms.